This is not a sponsored video by any means, but this right here is probably the best thing that has come to the market this year. So heartfelt, if someone from your team is watching this, hook me up. It started snowing. If you hear some weird noises, it's because my neighbor just moved in, so he's like renovating and cleaning up and all that, and I can't sit down in the basement anymore. I need this light, and look at this, it's like natural lighting, a whole big window just in front of me, and it's just But today's video is all gonna be about basic video settings. I'm going to try to keep this like pretty short and simple so that anyone who is watching this could understand why you do it and what you should do. I've seen a lot of videos that are going through basically the same thing, but they're using all these fancy words and not explaining them, and just like they are like thinking that you already know something. I'm gonna try to explain this that in a way that if you are just thinking about starting filmmaking or vlogging or something, then you will understand this. This is your first video you watch, and hopefully the last one you need to watch about this same topic. Alright? Let me know in the comments down below if I managed to explain this as easily as I think I can. Let's jump into it. Okay, first of all, I am going to use the words FPS, frames per second. Basically, that is how many pictures your camera is taking in 1 second. For example, if you're shooting in 24 FPS, so that will mean 24 frames per second. Your camera is taking 24 frames in that 1 second. Simple, right? And in talking head sequences like this, we're just sitting here talking to the camera, we're vlogging outside, we're doing an interview or something. You should use 24, 25 or 30 frames per second. 24 or 25 frames per second is basically the same thing. It just depends on if you are in America or you're in Europe. In Europe we use 25 frames, in America they use 24 frames. It's because of like frequencies and in televisions and all that. Like, that's why I'm not gonna talk about that things, because it's getting way too complicated. But if you compare 24 frames per second to 30 frames per second, you are going to see some kind of like a little bit of differences in how it looks, because it's taking 24 pictures or it's taking 30 pictures. There's a slightly difference. Okay, so first of all, I'm not going to start comparing all the different frame rates or anything. I'm just gonna break it down to you, say what I prefer to use and what's like the standards that you should use. First, we got 24 frames per second. This is the most common and the most widely used frame rate. This is also known as the most cinematic looking frame rate. 24 frames per second is used for these kind of shots, talking head sequences, interviews, and basically shots that you don't need to manipulate in any means afterwards. You don't have to slow it down, you don't have to speed it up. It's like, that's it. It's the best thing to do when you're doing like typical vlogs and stuff like this, just talking to the camera. Then the 24, or in Europe the 25 frames per second is going to look the best. Especially in America, there's a lot of people that are filming in 30 frames per second. That's totally fine as well, but 30 frames per second is the NTSC fresh rate, and that is the things we're not gonna go in today, because I want to keep this as basic as possible. We're gonna go in depth into all the NTSC, PAL and all that, differences in frequencies. If you want to leave a comment, like everything, you know what to do. But yeah, so you can use 30 frames per second. It's not gonna look as good, in my opinion, as the 24 frames, but you can do it if you wanna, but I don't suggest you do it, so don't. I'm sorry. So that's it for the talking sequence. Use 24 or 25 frames per second. Depends on what your camera settings are. But 24, 25 for vlogging, for talking sequences, for sequences that by no means needs any editing on the speed or anyhow. Use that. Then we go in to the so-called slow motion sequences or B-roll sequences or whatever you want to call them. They are usually shot in 50 frames, 60 frames, 100 or 120 frames per second. Yes, that's a lot, I know. But let's stick to, for example, 50 frames per second, just to keep this short and basic. Normal sequences, as I just told you, is shot at 24 frames per second. If you shoot some B-roll on that in 50 frames per second, the things that you shot in 50 frames per second, you can slow down by 50% because you want them to be 24. Am I going too fast? Okay, let's break this down. I'm trying to break this down to you now really easily. You got 1 second of film. They shot in 50 frames per second. There's 50 shots in that 1 second. You want your sequence to be in 24 frames just because it's the most natural, as I said to you earlier. So what you're going to do is take this 50 frames per second and slow it down to 50%. Then you get the 25. You know, because 25 is 50% out of 50. So what's going to happen? The clip is going to be 2 seconds long because you slowed it down by 50%. It's getting the double the length of it. Because now in that 1 second is only 24 frames. In the other half is 24 frames. That's like 48, but you know, you get the point, hopefully. Do you? And then again with 100, for example, 120 frames per second, if you shoot 1 second of B-roll in 120 frames per second, in that 1 second you just shot, there's 120 pictures in it. For you to get that to look the most natural on your sequence, you need to slow it down to 20%. And when you slow that down to 20%, when you're slowing down a 120 frames per second clip to 20%, the clip is gonna play in really, really slow motion. That's when you get these like Peter McKinnon, Peter Lindgren, Daniel Schiffer style B-roll, slow motion, cool shots. But then again, you have to remember, if you shoot 1 second in 120 frames per second and slow it down to that 20%, you're gonna get like a 6 second clip. So you just then cut it and... Did I just dab? I think I just did. Just to get this frame rate stuff to one nutshell, it basically 24 or 25 frames per second is mainly used for talking, for interviews, for vlogging, for these kind of sequences. Then again, if you are using anything above 50 frames per second to like 120 or 240 or whatever your camera can do, that is used to slow down or to be able to do speed ramps and all that. You get it? The next thing what you need to do is go by the 180-degree rule. I have no idea why that's called 180 degree. In my brain it doesn't make any sense, but that's why it's called. You can look it up. But that basically means if you're shooting this kind of sequence in 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be double the frame rate. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be in 1/50. If you're a photographer, that might sound like you just got stripped down to like only using one shutter speed. And that's true. You are. I'm sorry, but you are. If you use anything under 1/50, it's gonna look really blurry and not natural at all. If you're going to use anything over 150, it's going to be like too smooth. And that doesn't look too natural either. And that's why the 1/50 shutter speed is the best for these kind of sequences, because of the motion blur, and the motion itself that happens on camera is the most natural looking. And this goes as well for the slow motion sequences. For example, if you are shooting B-roll in 120 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/250. 120 times 2, that's 240, but there's no setting like 240, so 1/250 is the way to go. I know it might sound weird, and that's just how it is to get like the most natural looking movement in camera. Then if you shoot at 50 frames per second, you can slow it down to 50%, but your shutter speed should be in 1/100. In some cases, you might, for example, if I go out now and shoot 24 frames per second with a shutter speed in 150, it's gonna blow out. It's gonna be so overexposed, and it's going to look really bad. And it's totally natural for you as a photographer that you wanna scroll up that shutter speed and get a little bit more darkness in there. Don't do that. Don't stop it. Don't even think about it. Get a neutral density filter. The neutral density filter basically works as sunglasses for your camera. You know when you put that sunglasses on and everything just gets darker? That's exactly what happens. And I am using a neutral density filter right now, and if I take that away, you're gonna see how it looks. I'm shooting in 25 frames per second with a shutter speed with 1/50 and with the neutral density filter on, and this looks pretty damn good. But now when I take that off, how do you like it now? It's pretty damn overexposed. That does not look good by any means. I'm like, look at my shirt. I'm in heaven right now, or I am heaven. And now you can see again some detail on my shirt. Now it's like I came down from heaven. I'm an angel. Hopefully I could explain to you that in some kind of smart way, and in a way that you understand it as a beginner, or even though if you're a photographer and been in the game for a long time but want to start doing videos as well. Hopefully you get anything out of this, and if you do, and if this brings value to your table, please consider liking and subscribing to the video. I appreciate that really much. In the meantime, go have a look at my Instagram at gimme.elias. That's me right here. And yeah, we're gonna be back next week with a whole nother video again. Peace. Jaffa Juicy Mango. This is like really best thing ever when it's cold. No, it's not even that cold anymore because I went because I was waiting to film this, so I had it just on the table. But you know, who cares? It's good, still good.